2024 was the best reading year I've ever had. I read 154 books in 1 year. And I'm going to review them all. I'm going to review all 154 for you right now. I did think about ranking them, but to be honest, I couldn't be bothered. And by the time I'd probably finished that ranking, I would have not been bothered to make the video. So then there'd be no video at all. The first book I read in 2024 was The Unloved by Deborah Levy. This follows a load of people on holiday in Europe somewhere. It features a lot of similarities with her more well-known book, Swimming Home, the one that was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. I did like it. I still love Levy as a writer. I think she's very eloquent. She's very precise. She's one of the best working writers we have today. I just could not tell you what happened in this book or what was going on at any point. I think sometimes writers have a tendency to keep their reader at arm's length when they're trying to do something intellectual, and I definitely think that's what was happening in this book. You can see Levy figuring out her style and how she wants to confront certain themes. She just does it better in her later books. The Employees by Olga Ravn follows a crew on a spaceship light years away who have touched down on an alien planet. Some of this crew are people and some of them are androids. They have collected these strange artifacts from the planet's surface. These artifacts have started to commune with them, and the book is structured as a series of witness statements about these artifacts. Now, if you're thinking that sounds very high concept, you'd be right, but I absolutely adored this book. The way that it tackles themes like workplace exhaustion, mortality, being a tiny, tiny speck in a giant universe, it's just so subtle and so wonderful, all wrapped up in this weird Annihilation-esque sci-fi mystery. I just loved it so much. Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan follows a very quiet, very subdued family man in a small Irish community. This book is about the Magdalene Laundries effect on the Irish community. Magdalene Laundries were these institutions set up by the Catholic Church that housed fallen women. They are a very, very dark piece of Irish history. And this book not only deals with how these places affected the communities they were close to, but also about being culpable, about being complicit in the damage that they've done. It's a very quiet, sometimes quite maudlin, sometimes quite bleak little book, but it's really beautiful. It has quite an uplifting ending. I really, really liked it, and it made me aware of how subtly beautiful Keegan is as a writer. Saha by Chu Nam-ju is a dystopian science fiction book from the same author as Kim Ji-young, born in 1982. This book is essentially billed as a mystery. Someone is found dead in a car. The suspect is someone from the lower Saha estate rather than the higher, more wealthy estate. And I thought this book was going to follow this boy as he tries to prove his innocence. It does not do that. It follows a load of random characters. It's very scattershot. It doesn't really follow one set narrative. And that would be fine if any of the narratives this book was trying to tell was in the least bit interesting, and they're not. The characters aren't complex or interesting enough for you to want to spend time with them, and the stories that the author tells with these characters aren't interesting or engaging enough for you to want to pay attention to them. The dystopian element of this book is also not really exciting either. All the author is really doing is going, "Oh, wouldn't it be bad if we lived in a dystopian society?" But it's kind of not really different enough from the society we live in now to be any sort of allegory or metaphor. It just feels like now. Happening by Annie Ernaux documents the author's attempt as a young woman to terminate her pregnancy. I've loved every Ernaux book I've read up till now, and this one is no different. The way that she so sparsely yet so emotively writes about her own life is completely enviable. It's not an easy read in the slightest, but it's very stark, it's very honest. It's very well written, very well translated. I think it's a really important read. Ghost Music by Anne Yu follows a piano teacher whose life is kind of falling apart. Her husband wants to leave her. Her bereft, emotionally distant stepmother has come to stay with her, and also she sometimes sees talking mushrooms. It's a very strange, very well written little book about pursuing the things that you want to do with your life. It reminded me of Murakami in the best way, in that it's about the real world interacting with a slightly magical world that lives just under the surface. I really, really liked it and didn't expect to. It was one that I just picked up for 99p on Kindle, and it just shows you never know what you're going to enjoy until you start reading it. The Wind That Lays Waste by Selva Almada follows a preacher and his young daughter who have to shelter with a shelto? What the hell does shelter mean? They have to shelter with a mechanic through a very harsh storm. I really liked the theological conversations this book was trying to have. It's just so short, and I found the characters quite bland. It's just not long enough to have the conversations and the discussions it wants to have in any depth. And the plot didn't really go anywhere exciting enough for me to stay engaged. It was fine. I've read another Armada book, which we'll talk about in a bit, but I just didn't enjoy it. I found it quite bland. Poor Things by Alistair Gray. I'm sure you all know what this book is about. It's about a mad scientist who brings a woman back to life by putting the brain of her unborn child in her brain. I didn't explain that very well. I really liked my time with this book. It's written in a really whimsical way. The characters are very engaging. The world is very engaging. It's quite different from the film. So if you've seen the film and aren't really interested in picking up the book, I would say do pick it up because they're quite different. The ending specifically is quite different, but it's just a really good exploration of what it's like for man to play God and the repercussions of that. It's a modern day Frankenstein. I really liked it. I read I Am, which is the memoir of author Maggie O'Farrell. O'Farrell is the author of one of my favourite books, Hamnet, so I was really excited for this, and it did not disappoint. It's really eloquently written. It's a wonderful exploration of the randomness of life. It made me tear up several times. I really liked it. I can't wait to finish off her bibliography. I read The Two Towers. This was a reread. I have read these books several times now. You know, there's nothing really more to say about them. They're very slow, but that's part of the charm. You know, you just want to be bored by this old man for a while. I love these books. I'll love them forever. I'll probably reread them several more times in my life. Rapture's Road by Sean Hewitt is a poetry collection by the man who wrote All Down Darkness Wide. I loved that book and I was looking forward to reading some of his poetry, and it didn't disappoint. It's really eloquent, really beautiful. I will say I'm not really a poetry reader or enjoyer. I find poetry really hard to understand, but what was here was really enjoyable. It just mostly went over my head. I read A Tempest of Tea by Hafsa Faisal. I'd never read any of her books before, but this sounded really intriguing. It's about a tea shop run by vampires and they have to pull off a heist. To get what, I can't really remember. It's been, 12 months since I read this book. And I like the setup, I like the characters. I just did not enjoy the execution at all. I think the world building here is great. I just think this book has a problem with geography, whether that's in its action scenes or in its larger set pieces. It's a plane. How dare somebody fly over whilst I'm filming a video? I just could not figure out where stuff was going on in relation to other stuff. It didn't make sense to me. And when you have a very tense, long period of book that's a heist, and something's going on in this room and something's going on in this room, I need to figure out how they work in relation to each other, and I could not do that during this book. I found the heist section of this book, which is the bit you're kind of waiting for, really, really confusing and anticlimactic, and I felt like it was a mistake on the author's part for the heist to not be the climax of this book. The heist happens and then the book goes on for quite a while after it. There's some really good prose in this book and there's some really bad prose in this book. There's lines like, "They had always been destined to meet," and it's just, you feel let down when some of the other prose is really, really good. There's just too much cliche. There's too much stuff that feels so contrived. The reveals feel so ham-fisted. The romance feels so star-crossed lovers, and not all romance in books has to be that. Sometimes two people can just meet and fall in love. I was just really disappointed. I was really disappointed because I was really looking forward to it. I didn't dislike A Shining by John Fosse. It's just really strange and also really, really bland. The book is about a man who gets lost in the forest and he sees this glowing man. But all I could think about when I was reading it was that bit in The Simpsons when Mr. Burn comes out of the forest and he's going, "I bring you love." You know the bit. This man won the Nobel Prize for Literature, by the way. I mean, probably not for this book, but I'm going to read you the first few sentences and you can make up your own mind about how engaging the writing is. "I was taking a drive. It was nice. It felt good to be moving. I didn't know where I was going. I was just driving. Boredom had taken hold of me. Usually I was never bored, but now I had fallen prey to it. I couldn't think of anything to do, so I just did something. I got in my car and drove. And when I got somewhere I could turn right or left, I turned right. And at the next place, I could turn right or left. I turned right, and so on. I kept driving like that." It's not the most engaging. Peach by Emma Glass was just fucking weird. It reminded me a lot of Max Porter in the best way. It's really well written, but again, it's just weird. There were just so many choices that the author made that were just so strange to me, and most of the time at the detriment of what the author was trying to say about sexual assault. For example, The character's teacher is made of spaghetti and he's just like tumbling all over the place. And I just found it so distracting and so strange that I couldn't really focus on anything else that the author was trying to do. Down the Drain by Julia Fox. This is a memoir by the Uncut Gems lady. I like this. I don't really normally read celebrity memoirs, but this was fun. It was a wild ride. I enjoyed it. I've recommended it to people who want something fun and engaging and are trying to get back into reading. And I think it is that. It's very engaging, it's very fun, it's very wild. The Outsider by Albert Camus. I understand why this book has endured, but I found it quite bland. It's a book about a man who doesn't conform, and I think that's very relevant. I think it's, you know, clearly a very important piece of literature. I just found the writing to be quite bland, and it's very interesting to me that Camus didn't consider himself a nihilist when this book is very, very nihilist. I really liked An Education in Malice by S.T. Gibson. I thought it was very gothic. I thought it was very fun, very exciting, queer vampire book. I understand some people were disappointed with this book when it came out, but I really enjoyed it. I thought it was fun. I mean, according to my Goodreads, I read Almond by Son Won Pyung this year, but I couldn't tell you a single thing about it. I'm reading this description right now, and I don't remember this book at all. I kind of remember this cover. Apparently I finished it on February 5th. No memory of it. My second NO of the year was I Remain in Darkness. I absolutely love this book. It floored me. It's bleak and beautiful in equal measure. It's a diary that the author kept towards the end of her mother's life. It's a wonderful exploration of familial love, of life and death. It's just beautiful. It's very bleak and quite sad, but I loved it. Speaking of bleak and quite sad, I read The Whale Tattoo by John Ransom this year. It follows a young queer man living in King's Lynn, which is not that far from me, and he feels like death is following him everywhere. It's just absolutely exquisitely written. The prose is unlike any prose I've ever read before. It's a wonderful exploration of what it's like to be a young queer man living in an isolated community of young queer love. It's just so good. I read Kudos by Rachel Cusk this year. This is the third, I think, book in her Outline trilogy. I felt like I owed it to myself. I'd read 2. It was the last one. I felt like I just needed to read it. And I couldn't tell you a single thing about it. I find Cusk's writing quite bland. I'm really sorry. I know she is quite revered in literary circles, but she's never done anything for me that has made me go, wow, this is really deserving of the praise that it gets. I found all 3 Outline books to be very similar, kind of doing the same thing, and I've just never really enjoyed them that much. A Minor Chorus by Billy Ray Belcourt follows a young, queer, Indigenous doctoral student who puts his PhD or dissertation on hold to try and write a novel. This ended up being one of my favourite books of the year. It's so slight, but it talks about queer relationships to your community, again, like The Whale Tattoo, but specifically through the Indigenous lens. Again, it's just so wonderfully written. I just loved it, and I think it needs to be talked about more. I don't think it's actually properly published in the UK, so it could be quite hard to find, but I loved it. I wanted to keep reading queer books, so I picked up Boller, and I kind of regret picking it up right after A Minor Chorus, because man, oh man, is this book so dark and bleak and horrible. I didn't give it a rating when I first read it, and I still don't think I can, because I think it explores some very important things. It's very well written, but oh my god, it's so bleak. It just made me feel like a shell of a person. It just was such an unpleasant reading experience. Vladivostok Circus by Eliza Schuur-Duspan is the third book I've read by this author. I really liked her first 2, Winter in Sokcho and The Pachinko Parlor. And this was kind of a letdown. I didn't find this book as exciting or interesting as I found her first 2. It still feels very liminal, very dreamlike. It follows a woman who is staying with a circus troupe in Russia, but it just was not as engaging as her first 2 books, and that was disappointing to me. I hope her next one is a return to form. I read the Kamigawa Food Detectives, and it solidifies my opinion that no series that follows this sort of format will ever be as good as Before the Coffee Gets Cold. The premise of this is that a person will go to this restaurant and will say, I would like to try this dish from my past, and the people will make it for them, and then they'll have the dish from their past, and they'll go home. And that's basically it. I think the reason none of these books work in the way that Before the Coffee Gets Cold does is because Before the Coffee Gets Cold does not fix whatever problem this person has brought with them to the coffee shop. It presents them with a way to fix it, but it doesn't fix it for them. It lets them do the legwork. Whereas all these other series, the Kamigawa Food Detectives and the other ones in that format, just fix the problem for these people. They just fix it for them. There's no emotional work done by the protagonist in each of these little stories to fix the problem for themselves. And I think that's why they're so unsatisfying, and that's why this book was ultimately so unsatisfying. I read A Deadly Education by Naomi Novik this year, and I liked the world that this book was set in. This book is just too info dumpy. It's set in this magic dark academia school where anything in this school could essentially kill the students at any time. And I liked that premise, but the way that this author tells you about this world is so clunky. She will pause action scenes to give you several pages of information. A huge terrifying monster will burst through the door and the protagonist will be screaming from the monster, and then she'll pause the action and then turn to the camera and be like, by the way, this monster is this thing, it's terrifying for these reasons, it's been here all these years, and this info will go on for pages and pages, and she'll be like, right, have you got that? Cool, back. And then we'll carry on with the action scene. It's so clunky, it really, really halts any momentum that the author has built, and it's ultimately made me not really want to continue with the series. I understand they get better, I'm just not really invested enough to want to carry on. I read the first Slow Horses book, which I liked. I will say the series is infinitely better. I've read 2 of these now. I've read the first 2. The series is just better. I know that's very rare, but the series is funnier. It doesn't objectify women in the gross way the books often do. It gives more context. It tells more story. They're just better. I've read 2 now, and I don't think I'll read any more. I'll just continue watching the series. The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson is the first book in his epic Stormlight archive. I really liked this book. I will say I don't think Sanderson is the best actual prose writer in the world. His prose is often very bread and butter, very bare bones. His character work and his world building are incredible though. I cannot fault him there. The only minor gripe I had with this book really is that his humour is often the worst dad jokes in the world that you've ever heard, and they made me groan, but he would try and pass the characters who told these awful dad jokes off as very witty. They'll tell just an awful dad joke and they'll be like, ho ho ho, he laughed at his own superior intelligence. And it's no, they were just bad. They were bad jokes. They're not clever for telling them. So Late in the Day by Claire Keegan is a short story that follows a man who is bitter about his wife's having left him just before their wedding. I will always admire Keegan's ability to tell a fully rounded, involving, exciting, and also beautifully written story in as fewer pages as she can. Her stories are always so well written, so engaging. The characters feel like real fleshed out people. And what she does in this story is no different. And when you get the title drop in the book, it's really satisfying. It's a wonderful exploration of toxic masculinity, misogyny, in so few pages. It's so good. I love Keegan. I think she's really, really good. Resuscitif by Toni Morrison is the author's only novella. This was my first Morrison. It follows 2 women who begin as childhood friends, and we follow them through their life. One of them is black, one of them is white, and you are never told which they are. It's a book about prejudice, it's a book about stereotype. As I say, it was my first Morrison. I really admired what she was doing in this book. I just wish it had been longer and maybe delved a little bit deeper. Erasure by Percival Everett. This was the basis for the movie American Fiction. I read this because I watched the movie American Fiction and really liked it. I wanted to read the book, and it's basically the same as the film. And it's really, really interesting how relevant this book still is, even though it's, you know, going on 2 decades old now. It's really difficult to talk about this book without falling into the sort of thing that it talks about, but I do think it's a very, very worthy exploration of the sort of fetishization, I can't say that word, you know what I'm trying to say, of Black people in literature, because I also think it's something that happens to queer people in literature. They end up as stereotypes or trauma porn for people, you know, straight white people, to feel good about themselves for reading. And I think that's still very relevant. The Country Will Bring Us No Peace by Matthew Simard is about a couple who move to a very remote small town after the death of their child. It has notes of urban and folk horror. I really enjoyed it, but I couldn't tell you what the heck was going on for like the latter half of the book. I think the reveals towards the end feel a bit too messy, and I couldn't really explain to you what the twists were in the end, but I still very much enjoyed my time with it. Who Killed My Father by Edward Louis is an exploration of the author's relationship with his father in respects to his own queerness. I think any person whose family members have been ashamed of their queerness will really relate to this book. I saw many, many parallels in this book with my own father and his relationship to me. It's really well written, and I really enjoyed it. It's really good. Martyr by Keva Akbar was hands down my favourite book of the year. I read it in March, and I have not stopped thinking about it since then. It follows a young man who is obsessed with death. He is an Iranian immigrant. His mother died in an accidental plane shooting. And through his life, he's been obsessed with the idea of death, about what death means, about what it even is. It's so eloquently written. It's so unique. It's so funny. The characters have real weight and heft. I just loved it. It's one of my all-time favourite books now. My Death by Lisa Tuttle was a wonderful little mystery of a book. It is about a woman who is obsessed with this author, and she finally gets the chance to interview her. But when she does, she seems to know very private things about her life that only she could know. It's a very fun little novella. It's very well written. The mystery is really engaging. I really liked it. Boulder by Eve Baltazar follows a woman who is in a relationship with another woman who tells our protagonist that she wants to have a child. Now, our protagonist does not want to have a child, and we sort of go from there. It's a very claustrophobic book. It's really, really short, but it took me quite a while to read because the writing is so heavy. It really weighs upon you. I really, really liked it. I think it's really well written. I think it's interesting to read books about women who don't want to have children. I think that's a perspective we don't see masses of. It's just a really claustrophobic book about what it's like to be weighed down by the people that you love. Here Again Now by Okechukwu Nzele is a really sad but beautiful queer book about living your honest life and not saying things before it's too late. I don't want to go into too much detail about the plot because I think it's one that you should go into a little bit blind. It has a few reveals in it, but I really, really loved it. It's very sad, but I think it has a lot of beautiful meaning. I have read Pond by Claire Louise Bennett, but I could not tell you what it was about, what happened in it, how it was written. I couldn't tell you anything about it. I read it in March apparently, but I remember reading it. But I don't remember a single thing about it. So I think that tells you all you need to know about that book. I then read another Keegan. I read Foster. It's just a really beautiful story about a young girl who goes to stay with an older couple whilst her mother prepares to have another child. It's just a really quaint, really subtle story about the things that we don't say to one another. Bad Habit by Alana Espotero is a novel about what it's like to grow up as a trans woman. It's a perspective I don't read a lot about. I don't think a lot is published from this perspective. So I think it's really, really valuable. I think it's really, really important. It's really well written, really well translated. I think it's a very important book. And I think more people should read it because I think it's very, very good. Self-Portrait in Green is a book about a woman who sees this mysterious green woman and becomes obsessed with her. It's very French, if that makes sense. Its meaning is very veiled, very shrouded, is not given to you outright or at all. I thought it was very bewildering. I've thought about it often, but I couldn't say with any real love in my heart. Let's Split Up by Bill Wood is every Scream and Scooby-Doo fan's dream. It's like a mashup of the two. It's very schlocky, it's very boo-movie, it's very fun. If you like either of those two things, I think you'll have a good time. I read The Island of Missing Trees by Elif Shafak this year. This is my second Shafak, and I just absolutely adore her. I just love how unique her books are. I think she's a storyteller unlike any other. One of our perspectives for this book is a tree, and I think that's really funny and really exciting, and it's just so wonderfully written. Her books are so full of love and wonder and family. They're just like a big old hug. I just love them so much, and I loved this book. They're not without their faults, and they're not without their sadness and their bleakness, but I just love her. Private Rights by Julia Armfield follows three estranged sisters who have to sort of mend their relationships after their estranged but very famous architect father dies. And also, the world is ending, it's constantly raining, the sea levels are rising. I love Armfield's prose so much, and I think that makes up for some of the kind of looser ends that this book might have. I don't think the story is particularly engaging, doing anything overly exciting. I think the world that she's created is very great, and her prose and her characters are always great, but it did let me down slightly in the story aspect. I then read my second Almada. I read Not a River. I did not like this book at all. I understand that it's an exploration of toxic masculinity, but I just found it really bland. I wish she'd told this story in a more engaging way. Crooked Plough by Itamar Vieira Jr. This is about two sisters and the community that they live in rural Brazil. I thought this was really well written, really well translated. I didn't find it engaging the whole way through, but I liked about 75% of it. And in my opinion, I think this should have won the International Booker last year. I'm really surprised that it didn't. I thought it was, I thought it was the clear winner out of all the ones that I read, which I think was only 2.5, but still. I read James by Percival Everett. This is a retelling of Huckleberry Finn. I did not expect to like this book as much as I did, but I really, really liked it. It's about the veils that we wear in society. It's about race and its connection to language. It is poking fun at the American literary canon. I really, really liked it. I think Everett is a writer who just knows exactly what he wants to do and executes it so well and with so much flair. The Young Man by Annie Ernaux. It's probably my least favourite Ernaux, just because it's so short that it just doesn't really say anything she hasn't said in her other books. This is a short recount of a relationship she has with a much younger man. As always, her prose is insightful and sparse and very well written, but like I say, it's just too short to really say anything that involving. I read Ariadne by Jennifer Saint last year. This is my second Jennifer Saint. I really enjoyed it. This is probably the most I've enjoyed a ancient Greek retelling since Circe. I think it's just a really well-told story. I think it does lose momentum in the sort of latter half of the book, but it's a minor quibble. I still think it's a really competently put together book. I mostly only read For Thy Great Pain, Have Mercy on My Little Pain because it's set in Norwich and that's where I live. And I thought this book was going to be an exploration of how religion treated women in the past, and it kind of is, but I mostly just felt like I was being preached at, and that's not really what I came to this book for. I reread Dune this year because I read it first in 2021 or maybe 2020, before the first movie came out, and I didn't like it, and I really liked the movie, and the second movie was about to come out or had come out, so I wanted to reread it to see if I felt the same, because I've loved both of the movies and I remember disliking the book, but I really liked the book on a reread. I think it's actually one of the only things that I can say where it helps you to have seen the adaptation first, because this book's made so much more sense to me the second time around. I could really visualize the world and the characters and the motivations of the characters. I definitely think, and this might upset some sci-fi fanboys, but to be honest, this is too far into this video for them to ever see it, so who cares? I think the movies are better. I think they tell a more coherent, more satisfying story without all the ridiculous campy stuff that Herbert puts into the book, especially in the latter half. But I still enjoyed it, and I definitely liked it more than the first time I read it. I read Dark Places by Gillian Flynn, and as it stands, this is probably my least favourite Flynn, but that's not really saying much because I still think it's a really, really well put together and competently told thriller. I think you can tell that this is a writer trying to grapple with their own tone and form. Sharp Objects, her debut, is still my favourite book by her and one of my favourite books. I love it. Dark Places feels like an author trying to be bigger and better than the first thing she's done. It's her darkest book by a long stretch, but it doesn't really need to be. There's like some tonal problems that I think this book has that aren't there in her other books. That being said, she still knows how to tell a darn good story with some really interesting characters. I think her character and her plot work sort of overshadow any other quibbles I might have had with this book, apart from the ending. I don't like when in a murder mystery, the person who's done it is someone you haven't seen for most of the book. I think it's a bit of a cop-out, and that is what happens with this book. That being said, I did still really like it. I don't think Flynn has a miss in her bibliography. She's 4 for 4 for me. I've liked every book that she's published so far. A Man's Place by Annie Ernaux explores her relationship with her father. Again, it's sparse, beautifully written. She's so subtle and she's so quiet, but I think she's saying so much with so little. I read We the Animals by Justin Torres because I loved his second book, Blackouts, so much. It was one of my favourite books of 2023. And then I read this and I was quite disappointed. It didn't really grip me. It didn't do anything exciting for me. I can see why people love it, but it just did not move me really in any way. I found it quite bland and quite all over the place. The Door by Magda Szabo. I like reading books about class in other countries, and this book was really insightful, really interesting. I wish it had been shorter. I liked reading about the relationship between the writer and her maid, and I think she was a really interesting character. I just wish it had been shorter and we'd gotten to the meat of this book faster. I read the second book in the Stormlight Archive, Words of Radiance, after that, and I really enjoy this series. I will say this book is where I majorly felt the length of it. I didn't feel it as much in the first one, but this one, I definitely felt like we could have lost at least 100 pages and it wouldn't have been much different. I especially disliked the length of the interludes in this book that happen in between every sort of major part. And I understand that I'm sure he's creating this big world and everything's going to have relevance eventually, but I feel like there's a snappier way to do that when you're asking your reader to commit for at least 1,000 pages. I read This Is a Miko Do You Copy by Natsuko Imamura because I loved The Woman in the Purple Skirt, and this is by the same author. And I will say this was very meh. It didn't really have like a through line narratively. It was kind of all over the place. I didn't really care what was going on, and it left me feeling quite unfulfilled. Strangers by Taichi Yamada is the basis for the film All of Us Strangers, which is why I read it, and it was fine. It kind of really tells the same sort of story as the film, but I will say I feel like the film is maybe better because that added queer layer does so much of the heavy lifting in the film and it's just not there in the book. And the book, I think, gets really silly with all the ghost logic towards the end, and it kind of undermines any serious point it was trying to make. It was fine, I enjoyed it, but I think the film and what was added for the film, especially that queer layer, just made it better. I read my first Le Guin last year, which was The Word for World is Forest, and I did like this book. It's sort of that classic sci-fi story of people go to a planet and try to strip it of all its resources, and the indigenous population revolt. But what happens in this book, which I thought was a really interesting layer, is that what are normally a very peaceful people who live on this planet end up becoming very aggressive and more prone to war and fighting because of what people have done to this planet. I think because the book is such a thinly veiled metaphor for the Vietnam War, it ends up feeling more like a metaphor than a satisfying story with satisfying and interesting and engaging characters. It's still really well written, really well put together. I will read more Le Guin. I'm just disappointed this is where I started because I don't think this is her best book. I Will Write to Avenge My People is Annie Ernaux's speech from when she won the Nobel Prize for Literature. This is a good insight into why she writes what she writes and how she writes what she writes, but I think this is mainly for the fans. I wouldn't advise you start reading this book as your first Ernaux I would say start with something a bit meatier. I read what is probably my favourite to this day Cusk book, which is second place. This deals with a woman who has an artist come and stay with her, and they have a very fraught, very interesting relationship. I think it's definitely the deepest, most meaningful book I've read of Cusk's. I wish all her books were like this, because I found this one very meaty, and I find her other books quite bland. I reread Biography of X this year by Catherine Lacey. This remains one of my favourite books. It is a biography of an iconoclast, very controversial artist told by her widow. It is so extensively and well put together. I just really like it. I think it's unlike anything else I've ever read. Look at the Lights, My Love by Annie Ernaux is a year that Annie Ernaux took looking at a shopping centre, specifically a supermarket near her house. I love what the author had to say about the supermarket becoming the realm of the working class person. You know, she's always championed working class people in her work, and this book is no different. I also like what she had to say about how we trivialise supermarkets because very often they are seen as women's spaces, and I thought that was a really interesting point. She's such a clever writer, and I just really like her work. I think I've said it like 4 times already in this video, but I really like her. Clear by Karis Davis. This is about a man who ends up shipwrecked on an island with only one resident. He was supposed to go to this island to get rid of this resident because the land has been bought and he needs to get off. But this resident does not speak English. The lawyer does, and they have to try and find a way to communicate. I thought this was a really lovely book about the way that people communicate and the relationships that we can form without language. It's really lovely. It's really short. I really enjoyed it. I read Audition by Ryu Murakami, and I really hated this book. I thought it was really bad. I thought it was really misogynistic and just gross and not the schlocky, fun time I thought I had to sign myself up for. Evenings and Weekends by Oshima Kenna ended up being one of my favourite books of the year. This follows a group of interconnected people over a really hot summer weekend in London just before Brexit, I think in like 2019 maybe. It's about how life is full of unknowns. It's wonderfully queer. It features a really well-drawn, really fleshed out cast of characters. I really, really liked it. It's really good fun. In The Observable Universe, the author Heather McAulden documents her relationship with her parents, both of whom died of AIDS. She documents the creation of the internet and the history of AIDS as a disease. It's doing so much that you just can't help but admire it. It is so eloquently written. It's unlike anything I've ever read before. It's so good. I next read The List by Yomi Adegoke, and it ranked as one of my big disappointments this year. I really, really was looking forward to this book. I'd been told that it was a really fun time, a really insightful and fun look at cancel culture and how we discuss things online, but I just found it a bit icky. Unlike The Observable Universe that's doing so much so well, this book is trying to do too much and not doing any of them well, and in the end ends up doing its subject a disservice. Because I think there's a very valid reason in wanting to have a discussion about call-out culture, specifically online call-out culture, but ultimately what I think this book does is call into question the believability of sexual assault survivors. I don't think that's what this author intended to do, but I do think it's what she ends up doing. I then wanted to read something a bit more light-hearted, so I picked up Sweet Bean Paste, there we go, by Durian Tsukagawa. And this is just a lovely story about how the people in our lives shape our future, about the good things we can do for one another. It's quite sad in places, but I think it's a really lovely story. I read Parade. This was my 3rd Cusk of the year, and I kind of liked it. It was just, to be honest, it was a little bit pretentious, and it was kind of that thing, again, of a writer trying to do so much, and in the end it keeps the reader at arm's length because they're not allowing the reader in. It was very much that. I couldn't really tell you what this book was about. I read another No, this time it was Exteriors. These are musings and journal entries that the author has kept over the course of a year whilst living in Paris. Again, this is another book that comes to the defence of the working class. It's a defence of the urban space. I love No. I'll read anything she writes. I think that's fairly obvious by now. What is it, like 4 or 5 books I've spoken about in this video already? The Bone Season by Samantha Shannon. This is her first entry in her big dystopian urban fantasy series. And I really liked it. She throws a lot of stuff at the wall. It's dystopian. It's quite high fantasy. The magic system is absolutely bonkers, and I still don't quite have my head around it, and I'm 3 entries into this series now. But what Shannon is just absolutely brilliant at is telling a really good story with very engaging characters. Her world building is also just great. I really am enjoying this series. An Excellent Host by Chelsea G. Summers is a short story by the same author of A Certain Hunger, which is one of my favourite books. I really, really love it. And I really enjoyed this short story. It follows a man who's going to the apartment of a woman he's been kind of seeing because he thinks they're going to have a sex party, but really what happens is they kind of sacrifice him. It's really dark and really twisted and a lot of fun. Evil Eye by Etaf Ram follows a young Palestinian woman who slowly realises she's not happy in her life and she's not happy in her marriage. I loved what this book had to say about the double standards of marriage, about what's expected of men and women in a marriage, about the freedoms of women when they're in a marriage, specifically Palestinian women. Maybe the worst book husband ever. I hated the husband character in this book so much. I think he got off a little bit too light. I wished more bad things had happened to him. Strong female character is the memoir of comedian Fern Brady, a comedian I really, really like. I really, really enjoy her stuff. I think she's very, very funny. But she was diagnosed late in life. I say late in life as she's a young adult, so like 20s, I think late 20s, she's diagnosed with autism. I actually really learned a lot from this book. I think it's a really insightful look at the way that autistic brains work, and it's very approachable and very funny. And not without its darker moments, but I really enjoyed it. Termouche by Sven Holm is a dystopian book about a luxury resort where rich people can go and stay after an apocalypse. I liked what it had to say about how the disparity of wealth will affect the end of the world. I just kind of wish it had gone a bit deeper and it had been a bit more narratively focused. It was these short little vignettes and little scattershot moments rather than like a focused narrative. But I enjoyed it. Time for another no. This time it's a woman's story. I really enjoyed this book. It looks at the story of the author's mother and her relationship with her. I think it ties in really well to I Remain in Darkness. I think they're kind of like sister books. Again, I just love what she's doing. She writes in such a perceptive way. I really, really loved this book. All Systems Red is the first book in the Murderbot Diaries series. This is more of a novella, but I really enjoyed this book. It doesn't really reinvent the wheel, but what it does have is a really funny, engaging narrator, this titular Murderbot. There's a more overarching narrative going on with the Murderbot's past. It gets revealed sort of in later books, so I won't go into detail here, but I really enjoyed it. I think they're really fun and I love the narrator. Just by Looking at Him by Ryan O'Connell is about a gay man with cerebral palsy who is a writer on a television show. It looks at how his cerebral palsy affects his relationship, but also it's kind of like a rom-com sort of book. I enjoyed it. It's very fun. It's not to be taken very seriously. It's not overly well written. The prose is a bit too conversational. Like, they'll use like in a sentence a lot, and sometimes whole paragraphs will be ended with, and I was just like, lol. So if you can get past that, it's good fun. But sometimes the author will have a tendency to just kind of talk about these problems rather than them be interwoven into the narrative, which I think would have been more satisfying. I reread Normal People this year. It's one of my favourite books. I love Sally Rooney and it remains one of my favourite books. It's just so good. If you don't know what Normal People is about, you've clearly been living under a rock. I feel like I don't need to explain it. But I just love it. I think she's a wonderfully subtle writer. And having read a lot of Annie Ernaux now, I can totally see her influence on Rooney's work. They, A Sequence of Unease by Kate Dick, is a short story collection about England being slowly taken over by the titular they, a sort of censor group. There's a new introduction by Carmen Maria Machado, which is more enthusiastic about this book than I feel I could be. I liked it. I didn't really take most of it in. It lost my interest about halfway through. That most of the stories are quite samey. I couldn't really relay to you what happens in any of them. But it is nice that this, what was thought of as a once lost piece of literature, has been found and reprinted, I think. It Lasts Forever and Then It's Over by Anne Markin is a literary zombie novel. 2 words I bet you never thought you'd hear together. It follows an undead woman as she tries to remember the life she had before she died. I wish it had had more plot because it is very light on plot. It's just vibes. It's very well written, but I did not find it very engaging. The atmosphere is great. It's very much about how the things outside of your life and outside of you make up who you are as much as the things that are inside of you do. I just wish I had found it more engaging. Hagstone by Sinead Gleeson is about a woman who is invited to go and live with a commune of witches on a remote island. She's an artist, she's invited to go and work within their commune. Now you might think that sounds great, and I wish I could tell you that it was, but unfortunately it was very boring. It did not cash in on its promise at all. I thought it was going to be a lot more atmospheric. It's well written, but the ending is so anticlimactic. I just found that it did not mean anything to me when I'd finished it. I read Letters to a Young Poet by Rainer Maria Rilke. I don't really have much to say about this. It's some nice writing advice, still very well written, still quite relevant. My Year of Meats by Ruth Ozeki follows a woman who has been charged to make a program about traditional American dishes for a Japanese audience. We simultaneously follow the wife of one of the executives who makes this TV program who lives in Japan. It's a very strange, very interesting premise. As always with Ozeki books, it takes a while to get to the point, but I think it's still an interesting book. It's not particularly aged well. It's about 20 years old now, but I still liked it. Elena Knows by Claudia Pinheiro is a book that follows an older woman who is convinced that her daughter's suicide was actually a murder. It's a very bleak book, but I think it's a very important book. It looks at the way that women's bodies are treated by the church. It looks at female body autonomy. It contains a lot of really interesting parallels between Elena's body, who is severely crippled, and her daughter's body, who was expecting a child. It's a very sad book, but I think it's a really engaging, really important book. I read Intermezzo by Sally Rooney in May of this year. It quickly became not just my favourite Rooney book, but one of my all-time favourites, I think. She is such a subtle and perceptive writer. The way that she writes about family, about love, about life, about the meaning of your life, about capitalism and society, I just think she's doing it like no one else. I love her. If you haven't read Intermezzo yet, please do. Even if you think you don't like Sally Rooney, I promise you, you'll probably like it. Lonely Castle in the Mirror is a fantasy book about a load of children who find a mysterious magical castle on the other side of the mirror in their bedrooms. Inside the castle is a magical room, and the first person that finds it, their wish is granted. I thought this was a really sweet book. It's maybe a little bit too long. I think everything is too long, to be honest. But it's a really lovely book about the loneliness that children can suffer from sometimes. It's very heartwarming, very sweet. I would wholeheartedly recommend it. It's a lot of fun and very sweet. All the Violet Tiaras by Jean Menzies is a look at queer Greek myth retellings. I only really found this book interesting when it was talking about retellings that I had read, so that's kind of a fault of my own, but just be aware of that going in. It talks about a lot of different texts, some of which I had read, some of which I had not. I found it less interesting when she was writing about stuff I hadn't read, which is not really her fault, but If Beale Street Could Talk by James Baldwin, I loved this book. I thought it was a wonderful exploration of the vilification of black men. I think it's really well written. I think it has a wonderful narrator, wonderful characters. My favourite of the two Baldwin books I've read so far. I read Everything's Fine by Cecilia Rabis, and I really liked it, which is apparently a controversial opinion. I think a lot of people went into this book expecting it to be just a straight romance. By that I mean, like, it is just a romance. I don't mean heterosexual romance, although it is a heterosexual romance. But I think this book is having a really interesting conversation about whether you can love someone and have someone in your life who is so completely opposed to the things that you intrinsically believe and the opinions and thoughts that make up yourself. And I think this book was a really good exploration of that. I think a lot of people reading this book maybe didn't realize that the author wasn't condoning some of the things that her characters did, because I struggled to understand where the contempt for this book came from, to be honest. I read The Trees by Percival Everett. This is my third Everett this year, and it really surprises me how different each of his books has been as I've read them. This is almost like a thriller horror novel. It follows two detectives as they try to solve a group of murders, and at each murder scene there is the same mutilated body who represents the murdered boy Emmett Till. It's a book about violence. It's a book about how violence breeds violence. I think the ending is maybe a little bit messy, but I still really, really liked it. Clean follows a maid who has been accused of murdering the little girl of the wealthy family that she works for. Whilst I did like this book, I think its commentary was kind of a little bit on the nose. It was just about how the wealthy family don't really view this maid as a real person with an outside life and a rich internal life. that exists separate to the family that she's working for. I still think it was enjoyable and worth the read, but not really saying anything new. The Guest by Emma Cline was just a fun, scrappy little book. It follows a young woman who is taken out to somewhere, I think Long Island, by her wealthy boyfriend. She embarrasses herself at a big extravagant party, so he breaks up with her and tells her to go back to New York, but she can't do that because someone's looking for her because she owes them money, so she decides to just hang around on Long Island and hope that by the end of the week he'll take her back. She gets into a lot of fun escapades, very tense escapades. It's not like a whimsical book. I think I'm making it sound more silly than it is. At one point, she pretends to be a child's nanny and kind of kidnaps them. Open Throat by Henry Hoke follows a queer mountain lion who's living under the Hollywood sign, and doesn't that just sound like the best premise for a book ever? It's a book about queer loneliness, about trying to find a community you belong to. It's really nicely written. It's a really wonderful voice, a really nice character. It's written almost like poetry. It was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. How It Works Out by Miriam Lacroix is a sort of multiverse novel. In each chapter we follow the same couple, but in one chapter they might be cannibals who want to eat their children. In another chapter they might be a bug and a dog. In another chapter they might be a boss and an employee. Sadly, just none of these examples are very entertaining though. I wasn't quite sure what the author was trying to say. It's quite a gross book. I really didn't enjoy it, and I think the premise sounded really exciting, so I was quite let down by this book. Anyone's Ghost by August Thompson follows a young man who falls in love with his best friend as they work together over the summer. It's a book about living your life with no fear, about saying things before it's too late, about toxic masculinity getting in the way of the things you want to feel. It was the bisexual sad book of the summer. I'm surprised more people didn't read it because I really liked it. Will I Ever Have Sex Again by Sophie Hagen is the author's look at sex and gender and our relation to both of those things. I really like Hagen as a comedian, and this book also did not disappoint. I really, really liked it. I think it's a very frank, very honest look at both sex and gender and our relation to both, but it's also very funny, full of a lot of humor. I think it's very approachable, but I also think it's a very valuable and very important book. Heatwave by Victor Jestin follows a young boy who is on holiday in France with his family. He witnesses a boy die, and rather than tell anyone about it, he just buries them in the sand on the beach. It reminded me a lot of The Outsider in that our narrator is very passive. I think, again, this is a book that is about toxic masculinity, about the things that boys hide inside themselves. It's a very odd, short little book. One that I didn't wholly enjoy, but it's only 100 pages. Like, you can do that in a couple of hours and see how you feel about it. To Be Taught If Fortunate by Becky Chambers follows a group of astronauts exploring a load of different planets light years away from our galaxy. I absolutely adored this book. It's about humans' need to explore. It's about the damage that we have done to this planet and will eventually do to the solar system. It's beautiful, sad and hopeful in equal measure. I really love Becky Chambers and the science fiction that she writes. More Days in the Murasaki Bookshop is the sequel to Days in the Murasaki Bookshop. This is just more of the same. It's like slice of life. It's very cute, very sweet. I wish it would focus more on the bookshop than the familial drama, but you know, they're fine. They are what they are. They're not like the best book that you're ever going to read in your life. The Possession by Annie Ernaux details the obsession the author had with her ex-partner and the woman he ended up in a relationship with. Again, it's very frank, it's very honest, but in a very subtle way. She talks about her need for lust over love, about the things we can do when love overtakes us. She's such an honest writer. She's not afraid to make herself look like a bad person, and I think that's very honourable. I read the second Dune book, and honestly, it was crazy. It was mad. I'm not going to pretend to know what was going on most of the time in this book. I'm just going to kind of wait for the movie, maybe, to see if I understand. You just have to kind of let Frank Herbert take you along for this ride and hope that you're going to catch most of it, but it is crazy. It's a very, very strange book. This series is so weird. I think I'm probably going to end my read of this series here. I don't really care about this series beyond Paul Atreides, and I think this is a very natural stopping point because, as I understand it, Herbert never actually got to finish the series, so I might just leave it here. All About Love by Bell Hooks is a look at lots of different forms of love, whether that be familial, romantic. I think it contains some lovely sentiments and messages about how we can love each other better, about how we can fight cynicism, I wouldn't necessarily say it taught me anything I didn't already know. And when it gets to the religious stuff, I just didn't really enjoy that. But on the whole, I liked it. I think it's a very valuable resource. Before We Forget Kindness is the 5th book in the Before the Coffee Gets Cold series. I don't know how this man is still able to come up with original stories to tell in this universe, but he is. I still really love this series. I haven't read one yet that I've thought is a dip in quality, so let's hope that he continues. As I understand, there's one more maybe to be translated, so hopefully the last one is good. Rosarita by Anita Desai follows a young woman who travels to Mexico. There she meets a woman who's adamant that she met her mother, despite the fact that her mother never went to Mexico. I remember this being a very well-written, sad book, but I couldn't really tell you anything other than that. I remember feeling that the characters just weren't very well drawn, weren't very interesting. I could not tell you what this book was about. The Bookshop Woman by Nanako Hanada follows a woman who is feeling a little bit disgruntled with her life, so she starts giving book recommendations to people online. Unfortunately, this book was just kind of underwhelming. It followed a very similar format. She just met a person, gave them a book recommendation, they either liked it or didn't, and then we move on to the next person. I don't really feel like I got anything from this book. It was just kind of bland. Wandering Stars by Tommy Orange follows an indigenous family from the 1800s to today. I did not realise this book was a sequel. I actually have the first book and haven't read it, and I read this one first. But I don't really think that matters. You can't really tell, and I think this book totally works by itself. What I think is really admirable about what Orange is able to do in this book is he has so many characters across so many different time periods, and he's able to give all of the problems that they face equal weight, equal time, equal measure. And the characters are just so well drawn. They feel like real people. They feel like real people with real problems, real conversations, real lives. It's a really wonderful book. I will be reading the first one. I realise I've gone about them in a slightly incorrect way. But like I say, this book does stand by itself. And I think it's a really, really, really good book. I really liked it. Held by Anne Michaels follows 4 generations of a family starting in the First World War all the way up to kind of present day. I think this is a really beautifully written book. You can so tell that Michaels is also a poet. I love what this book has to say about the long-term ramifications of war. I read this book because it was longlisted for the Booker Prize. And I think it's interesting that there are 2 books on the list this year, or rather last year, that tried to do that. And this one did it so successfully, and the second one did not at all. But I also think there were some things in this book that just didn't need to be there. I wasn't quite sure why Marie Curie was there. I don't know, but I still really liked it. I think it was really well written. Orbital by Samantha Harvey follows a day in the life of the people aboard the International Space Station. I absolutely adored this book. I think it's beautiful. I think it's a beautiful, beautiful book. I love books that frame human life in the universe, and that's exactly what this book does. It talks about us being a tiny, tiny speck in a giant universe, and I love that. It's almost like a nature book in the way that it describes our relation to the planet. It feels like reading a documentary. It feels so factual, but it's also so poetic, so beautiful. I loved it so much, and I was so pleased that it won the Booker last year. Enlightenment by Sarah Perry follows a small village in Essex. Specifically, it follows 2 people in that village, an older man and a younger woman. And we basically spend the entire book looking at their relationship to the church. I like this book was neither a condemnation nor an endorsement for religion. It looks at how the church can help people, about how it can hinder their lives. There's also a mystery at the centre of this book, but it's not really. It's fun, it's involving, but I wouldn't say it's the core of the book. It's really well written, really well told. It feels very traditional, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I just really liked it, and I did not expect to like it at all. Wild Houses follows a group of people who are all in some way or another involved in a crime ring in Ireland. I enjoyed this book for what it was. I thought the characters were really engaging. I thought it was really well written. I just haven't really thought about it since reading it. I know some people who absolutely loved it, and I'm really happy for them. I just didn't really feel any strong feelings one way or the other for it. The Safekeeper by Yael van der Woon turned out to be one of my favourite books of the year. I absolutely loved it. This follows a young reclusive woman who ends up having to have her brother's girlfriend come and stay with her, but then things start to get a little bit steamy. It's so well written. It has such a strong sense of place and time. It is about obsession. It's about queer longing. It's about reclaiming what is yours. It is so good. I've been trying to force it into the hands of so many people just because I think it's so good. Stoneyard Devotional by Charlotte Wood follows a woman who is kind of fed up with her life, so she goes to stay with a commune of nuns in the Australian outback. That is kind of the whole plot. I just described to you the whole plot of this book. What this book is a very quiet, very slow and subtle exploration of the meaning of life, what happens to you after you die, both physically, what happens to your body, and what happens to your mind. It is a look at community and friendship and love and life, all done so subtly and slightly that you wouldn't even know that it was happening in front of you. I've seen some people say that this book is very boring, and I can totally understand that criticism. I, however, absolutely adored it, and I read it in a day, and I think it's one of the most understated and well-crafted books I've read this year. My Friends by Hisham Matar follows a young Libyan man who ends up being a political refugee from his country when he attends a demonstration outside the Libyan embassy that turns into a shooting. I didn't explain that very well, but it's a very politically fraught book. It is a book about wanting to return to your homeland, but a homeland that does not want you, that you cannot return to. It's about the dichotomy of that, of wanting to return home, but knowing that you can't, knowing that the place you call home is heightening, becoming more increasingly violent, and standing against that and not wanting that, but still wanting to go there because that is where you feel home is and that is where your family is. It's also a book about friendship, about the things that we do for our friends and what ruins a friendship, what can come between those friendships. It's quite long and it's quite slow moving, but I think it's a book with so much heart. I really, really liked it, and I did not expect to. I only picked it up because it was longlisted for the Booker. I was really surprised that it wasn't shortlisted because I think it's a really important book. This Strange Eventful History by Claire Massoud is the other book that I talked about when talking about books that looked at the long-term ramifications of war that were on the Booker long list. And this book, you'd think that a book with the word eventful in the title would have some events in it. And yet this one does not. I really found this book so boring. So I just found it so dull. It's a long book, but oh my days, I was so bored. I only finished it because I wanted to read the entire Booker long list this year, and I did it. Actually, that's not true. I didn't read the entire Booker long list this year. I didn't finish one of them. I didn't finish Headshot. I hated Headshot. I couldn't finish it at all. I wish I'd given up on Strange Eventful History because it's one of the most boring books I've ever read. Creation Lake by Rachel Kushner follows a sort of private investigator, mercenary for hire, who is hired to infiltrate an eco-terrorist group in rural France. I thought this book was going to be more of a spy thriller. That's what all the quotes on the covers had told me that it was going to be. It didn't really end up being that, but I still liked it. Kushner has a wonderful knack of crafting really scrappy, complex protagonists, and that is the case here with our protagonist in this book. I can't remember her name, it's been a while since I read it, but I liked her. It's just such a strange book. It tries to be that kind of spy thriller with this woman infiltrating this terrorist group, but it also has so many large sections that are just musings about Neanderthals. It's so weird, and it does kind of work. I liked it. I didn't like it as much as The Mars Room, which is the other Kushner book I've read, but I still liked it. Playground by Richard Powers was my final book on the Booker long list that I finished. This is kind of his other side of the coin to the Overstory. It does what that book did for trees, for the sea. We follow a large, slightly interconnected group of people who all, in one way or another, have lives that feature the sea, are intertwined with the ocean. And for the most part, I liked it. It's very long, but I liked all of the characters. I thought they were all very well drawn, very relatable, very interesting, very complex characters. I liked what this book had to say about humans' connection with nature and how we are losing that connection with nature and forming more of a connection with technology. The ending, I still don't know how to feel about the ending. I don't think it ruins the book, but it certainly is what I think of the most when I think about that book. The Lantern of Less Memories. It's quite high concept, this book. It is set in the room you go to after you die, where you watch your life flash before your eyes by looking into one of those lanterns that you spin. But the 4 people we encounter in this room, they're missing a memory, so they have to go back in time with a camera to take a photo for that to be the memory, if that makes sense. It follows a very similar concept to Before the Coffee Gets Cold. I did quite like this book, though. It had some very nice musings on what happens to you after you die. It's very sweet. I didn't really have any feelings for it after I finished it, but I did still enjoy it. Nevada by Imogen Binney follows a young trans woman who realizes her girlfriend has been cheating on her, so she kind of throws her life in the bin, gets in a car, and goes on a road trip across America. I think this book is having some really honest conversations about what it's like to be a trans woman. This book isn't that old. I think it came out early 2010s. But the thing that makes me think that is that a lot of the language in this book is very dated. It's written in a very chatty, colloquial style, which I think does the book a disservice. But I think the important conversations that this book is having kind of negates all that. Liars by Sarah Manguso follows a woman who gets married to a man who she thinks is the love of her life, but he basically turns out to be a really, really horrible person. This book is kind of like Evil Eye in that it's an exploration of the expectations and things that women have to go through in a marriage. And if I thought that the husband in Evil Eye was bad, Liars is possibly worse. He's a really, really horrible, horrible, narcissistic man. It's a really, really well-written book that is sometimes very subtle, sometimes as subtle as a brick, but I really liked it. Artificial Condition is the second book in the Murderbot series. I really enjoyed this one. It furthers the sort of overarching narrative that began in the first one. I'm not going to go into detail just in case it spoils it for anyone, but this adds some very fun characters, especially the new sort of ship pilot character who I really enjoyed. And I still love Murderbot. I think they're a really fun narrator. I really am enjoying this series. The Last Gifts of the Universe by Riley August was sadly a very big disappointment. This is a science fiction book that is set in a universe that is being devoured by this evil entity. And our main character and her sibling are these researchers that are looking for caches that will hopefully reveal how to stop this thing. Also looking for them are 2 people who work for a big agency who are looking to monetize these caches. It's a fairly unsubtle, on-the-nose allegory for capitalism, but this book was just so bland, so unoriginal. It just was doing nothing new. It couldn't decide if it wanted to be like a cutesy, cozy sci-fi book, if it wanted to be like a Becky Chambers very hopeful sci-fi, or like Star Wars grand opera sci-fi. So it ends up just not succeeding at any of them. It's just so bland, unoriginal. It's basically all science fiction movies over the last like 60 years just mashed in together. I think maybe my biggest gripe with this book is when you are presented with aliens and alien societies and the author just does nothing original or new with them. The ancient alien society in this book functions basically like human society does, and I think that's really bland, boring, unoriginal, and lazy. I read The Third Gilmore Girl by Kelly Bishop because I love the Gilmore Girls. The Gilmore Girls, why did I say it like that? I know it's just Gilmore Girls, but I also love musical theatre, and Bishop originated a role in A Chorus Line, which was very interesting to read about. I will say this book does kind of, in moments, end up reading like a Wikipedia article, in that she focuses for a long time on the things I think we're all interested in, which is A Chorus Line and Gilmore Girls, and then she will mention basically everything else she's been in like quick succession, and I just don't think that's very entertaining. But the main 2 things that I was interested in, I did enjoy reading about those. I really enjoyed Small Worlds by Caleb Azuma Nelson. I think his prose is really well crafted. I think he's such a talented writer. It's about the expectations on young men. It's about the expectations of what men are supposed to do, about the sort of careers they're supposed to go into. I think it's very relevant. I found it very relevant. I really, really liked it. I thought it was really good. Oathbringer by Brandon Sanderson. This is the 3rd in the Stormlight archive. I am really beginning to feel the length of these books now. This book was so long. I definitely feel like 200 pages could have gone from the middle and we would have had a much more enjoyable reading experience. I do really like the characters. I'm really interested to see where this series is going. I feel like he's set up so much that I'm invested. I just wish he would get to the point a little bit faster. That said, what is here is fun. I'm having a good time with this series. I just wish they were just a little bit slimmer, just to save me some of my finite life. Starling House by Alex E. Harrow was a massive disappointment. I was really excited for this book, but it turned out to be a lot more unoriginal than I thought it was going to be. The protagonist's name is Opal, which I think is a dumb name for a character. I'm sorry if your name is Opal, but I think it's weird, and every time I would hear that she was called Opal, it would completely take me out of it, and I'd be like, what a dumb name. Oh wait, sorry, I meant to be paying attention. I just thought this book had so much promise. It was a mysterious house, this mysterious author, these mysterious books that she'd written, and it all just turned out to be, oh, we've got to fight the monsters. It was just that sort of book, and I thought, so much wasted potential. Chain Gang All Stars by Ajay Brenya Nanakwame was not a disappointment, however. I absolutely loved this book. I think the comparisons to the Hunger Games are very just, but I think this book is doing so much more. It's looking at the American prison system and how it treats people of colour specifically, whilst also just telling a really fun, really engaging narrative with really wonderful, engrossing characters. I think there's a couple of POVs we maybe could have left out, but I still really, really enjoyed it. These Violet Delights by Micah Never... I can never remember this guy's surname. I always want to call him Neverember, but that's not right. These Violent Delights by Micah Nema Ever. There we go. Nema Ever. This follows a young man who meets a very charismatic young man at university, and they form a very, very intense relationship, which results in them trying to murder someone. I kind of liked this book. I just wish it had maybe not taken itself so seriously. The protagonist is so angry all the time. It just becomes a bit one note in the end. I liked what this book had to say about the intensity of your first queer relationship. I just wish it had been shorter and had a bit more humour, because by the end it was just a bit of a slog to get through. She's Always Hungry by Eliza Clark is a short story collection. I really like this author's work. I am kind of on the fence as to whether I enjoy short story collections. I find them really disjointed. I find that the stories don't mesh well together, and that makes for a very unpleasant reading experience. And that was kind of the case here. We have stories that range from science fiction to character studies to science fiction again. Like, it's a mishmash of all sorts of different things. As a side note, I do much prefer when short story collections kind of all have a theme, when the stories are all sort of explorations of one theme, kind of like Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber, where they're all retellings of fairy tales, but that's by the by. But the thing with short story collections is because they vary so much in tone and theme, they vary so much in quality as well, and that is the case here. Some of them are great, and some of them I really liked, and some of them I just thought were either painfully average or quite bad. I think that my favourites were probably the science fiction ones, and there's one that's about like a eternal being that I thought was really fun, and when she leans more into the fun, I tend to have more fun, but there are some in here that I just did not enjoy. And again, that is kind of my feeling about short story collections in general, but also some of these stories I feel like could have been left out. I was really looking forward to Thirst by Marina Yusick, and it did kind of disappoint a little bit. The first section, where we follow the vampire through her life from a human to the present day, I thought was really interesting, but it was so fast paced and so quick that when we get to the second part of this novel that follows a woman who's caring for her ailing and dying mother, and the pace slows down to completely glacial, I think that creates a really harsh contrast between the two parts. I did enjoy this book. I just think it has a pacing issue, and I think tonally the two parts don't entirely work together. Ghostfall by Sarah Moss follows a young girl who is forced to go on an Iron Age live-action roleplay holiday by her emotionally and physically abusive father. I really like this book. I thought the writing was great. I think it's a really good exploration of misogyny, domestic abuse, of the idea of Britishness. It's a really slight and slender book, but I think there's so much going on under the surface. She's a new writer to me, but I hope to read a lot more by her because I really enjoyed this book. Rogue Protocol is the third Murderbot book, probably my least favourite so far, the least engaging. I don't really remember a lot about it. It doesn't really carry on the overarching narrative that much. I'm looking forward to getting back into the series, and as I understand it, this is people's least favourite, and things do pick up again in the next instalment. I reread The Great Gatsby because I read it for my GCSEs or maybe A-levels, I think, and I hated it, didn't like it at all. But something in me wanted to see if I still felt that way, so I reread it and I really liked it. I mean, I'm not going to really comment much on it. I feel like enough has been said about this book. You know, it's nearly 100 years old. There's nothing that I could possibly bring to the table that is new. But I liked it. I think it's a really good exploration of the American dream. It's very well written, some really good characters. I liked it. The Morning Star by Karl Ove Knausgaard is a very big, very strange book. Another one that reminded me a lot of Murakami in that it's about this magical world just under the surface interacting with the real world. We follow a large cast of characters who go about their day. Their lives kind of intersect, but don't really, and weird things are happening to them all as this large star begins to shine in the sky. As I said, it's a very strange book, but it's really beguiling, really arresting. I found myself really taken by it, even though literally nothing happens in this book at all, and it's like over 600 pages long. We'll Prescribe You a Cat is another one of those Japanese books that takes place in one establishment that services lots of different people. It's like a little anthology set in the same shop, basically, but not really, but kind of. This establishment will prescribe people a cat as basically like a form of antidepressant. It's very cute. There's a lot more cat death in it than I thought there was going to be. It's very sweet. Some of the stories hit, some of them don't. Very middling, but cute if you like cats. Summer Water by Sarah Moss follows the lives of a group of people who are staying in a holiday resort over a very rainy weekend in Scotland. Again, it's another short book from Moss, but with a lot going on under the surface. This is a book about xenophobia, about fear of the unknown. Again, it's really well written. I found it, again, really arresting, beguiling, interesting. She has such a way with words. I read Brooklyn because I really love the movie, and it's a shame to say it, but I think the movie is better. It tells a more interesting story. I love Saoirse Ronan, and I think her performance is really good. The book feels a lot more solemn than the movie does. I think the movie is a lot more uplifting. It basically follows the same plot. There's nothing really new. They didn't really do anything different. And I liked it. I just prefer the movie. We Do What We Do in the Dark by Michelle Hart follows a young woman who enters a relationship with her older professor at university. And then we see how that relationship sort of forms her life for the next few years. I really loved this book. I think it's really well written. I think it's a bit overwritten in places, but I think that is kind of a symptom of a debut novel. I love what it has to say about how your first queer relationship can shape your life for a while. I really, really liked it. I'm hoping we get a lot more from this author because I think this is a really promising start. Doppelganger by Naomi Klein. It made me feel very smart. I really like this book. I don't normally read nonfiction, but I really, really enjoyed it. The author Naomi, I'm about to do it. It's not Naomi Wolf. The author Naomi Klein constantly got confused for another author, Naomi Wolf, over the course of COVID. And this other author, Naomi Wolf, slowly descended into more far-right spaces. And this book, it covers so much, but it's ultimately about looking at how people who, were fairly central or left-leaning can become more indoctrinated into the far right. I think it's really insightful. I think it's really important. I think it's super, super relevant to right this moment. And it made me feel really smart. Ordinary Human Failings by Megan Nolan follows a tabloid journalist as he tries to wheedle secrets out of the family of a girl who has been accused of murdering a child. This is a book about the secrets we keep inside, about the relevance they have to ourselves, but maybe not to other people. It's about the pitfalls of tabloid journalism. I really, really commend Nolan on writing a book that is so different from her debut, but still handling it so well. The Collection of Spoons by Deborah Levy is a collection of essays by the author. This ultimately disappointed me because I didn't realize it was just going to be a random collection of things she'd already written. I thought it was going to be new writing by the author. It was not, and I paid £20 for the privilege of it in a demi-hardback, which I'm still mad about. Monsters, What We Do with Great Art by Bad People is an exploration of how we deal with, how we consume the art of people who we now consider to be bad people. And whilst I was intrigued with how the author was going to explore that premise, ultimately she does so well, I think, for the early part of the book, but it's just too long. It didn't need to be a whole book covering this subject. And I think part of this book is the author just kind of trying to assuage her own guilt with wanting to continue to consume the art of these people. And while she puts it more eloquently in the sum of a greater argument, the way that she ultimately concludes this book is by saying there's no ethical consumption under capitalism, which, if that's how you feel, that's fine. But for me, I wanted a little bit more. I read Brokeback Mountain, which ultimately did disappoint me because it was just so short. I feel like this should have been a whole novel, but we move at breakneck pace. I don't feel like I can connect to any of these characters. Or should I say we move at Brokeback pace? I ultimately just found it really bland and unemotive. Sorry. Tom Lake, however, by Anne Patchett, I thought was absolutely wonderful. This is a older woman retelling the story of her summer romance with a famous actor to her 3 daughters who have returned home due to COVID. I just thought it was a really gentle, lovely story, really well told. I just thought it was lovely. I just thought it was really, really good. I can't wait to read more by this author. Gifted by Suzumi Suzuki follows a young woman who's caring for her dying mother. This is ultimately too short to really go into any depth about what it wants to explore. I thought it was very well translated and I loved the cover, but it didn't do anything for me, unfortunately. The Idiot by Elif Batuman kind of suffered from the opposite. It was too long for me and didn't follow any form of really satisfying narrative. It's just these short little snippets. We don't get one cohesive narrative that this book follows. I did enjoy this book quite a bit. It's very funny. It's very well observed. I do think the 18-year-olds act far more precociously than any 18-year-old ever actually would in real life, but I still enjoyed it. Universality by Natasha Brown is by the author of Assembly, which I absolutely loved. Unfortunately, this book was a massive disappointment. The first part of this book is a long-form article about an attack that happened on a farm during COVID with a gold bar, but then this book just kind of loses all focus. It's supposed to be about the pitfalls of tabloid journalism, but I kind of already know that tabloid journalism is bad. I need you to go a bit more in depth, and unfortunately this book just didn't do that for me at all. The Mime Order is the second book in the Bone Season series. I like that this book does very different things to the first one. This book is wholly set in London. It's about the struggle to control this sort of crime syndicate and also like furthering along this dystopian narrative that we've got going on. I really enjoy it. I really like the world that this is set in. I really like the characters. The prose sometimes is a little bit clunky, but I'm still really enjoying this series. My final 2024 book is The Dead of Winter by Sarah Clegg. This is a look at all the mysterious ghosties and ghoulies that kind of exist around Christmas time. I thought this was a fun, if not wholly very in-depth book. If you're interested in things like Krampus and stuff like that and the sort of witchery traditions of Christmas, I think you'll like this book. The cover is gorgeous. It just didn't really go that much in depth for me, and it was quite repetitive. And that's 2024. I remember a lot more about these books than I thought I was going to be able to. Normally when I think about a book, I can't remember anything, but it turns out I do actually remember most of them. I think there were like 2 or 3 that I couldn't remember anything about, but I think that's normal, right? When you read 154 books in a year, my best reading year ever. Let's hope 2025 I continue on in the same vein. Fingers crossed. Happy 2025, everyone.